Much Maria. Of this only one day workshop, but we're very happy to have a second part. I think the first one was very interesting, and so now we are going to have as chair this academic secretariat of the institute, who, by the way, has been so generous to put out of her own pocket some of the cookies that we have been eating. The work that she has every day, she has been here the whole morning, and she's going to be here the whole evening. So stay with her. Thank you.
Now I'm going to introduce Soazig Le Bihan. She is professor of philosophy at the University of Montana and agrégate in philosophy and a former student of the École Normale Supérieure. Her research has focused on the philosophy of physics, especially the philosophy of quantum mechanics, scientific models, reason, and science and values. She's currently working on a book on scientific understanding with Armand Duval. Their book presents a comprehensive and pragmatic account of understanding that unifies all scientific practice. On their view, the great diversity of scientific practices provides understanding because they contribute possible solutions to relevant problems. She regularly teaches classes in the philosophy of science, the foundations of ecology, modern philosophy, philosophy of animals, and philosophy of law. And she's also director of the law program in the University of Montana. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hey. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you for all the good intellectual inspiration and engagement that we have all around this place. It's quite an exceptional place, I have to say. It's my first time in Mexico. It's my first time in Central America. It's my first time in Mexico. My first time in Mexico City, and the first time at UNAM. And I have to say, I had the best time. So thank you so much for that opportunity. All right. So I'm going to start with an apology. So Maria asked me to give a talk in that workshop. I actually don't really work in that area much at all, really. I have in the past, I have had interest in those issues, a long-standing interest. I published sometime in the long time past about the semantic view. But I don't have a very specific, I don't have a good, I don't have a thesis or a claim to make today, or an account to present or anything like this. I have some ideas about how we have been talking about structures and representation for the last 20 years to something like this, right? And what it does and what it doesn't do, and I also, I'm very interested in what Maria presented yesterday. And so I've been trying to think about, what is it that I like about it? What is it that I feel it can be problematic about it, and those kinds of things. So that's going to be that, but it's not very well. So in comparison to the talks we saw up to now, my thing is sloppy. So I apologize for being sloppy today. I don't like sloppiness. But I thought it's going to be more of a question mark than an assertion today. Yesterday, I had an account and I had claims to make. Today, I'm asking questions. All right. So overview of what I'm going to talk about. We have this strong intuition. Actually, that's actually very convenient. You have the slide there. I don't have to. I don't like the fact that I see myself, but I really like the fact that I see my slides. So I'll focus on the slide and try to ignore this shadow of we talked about shadow over lunch, the shadow of myself over there. All right, we have this strong intuition, or at least a lot of us, right? It seems like it's not only Maria and Ottavio and me who have this strong intuition that, how we make sense of the world has something to do about structure, about grasping structure, about something along those lines. But structured talk, of course, has limitations, and we are very well aware of this. And so I guess when I came, I started thinking about today's talk, and I think, well, what is left after all these people told us that structure was not going to do it, right? They can't do it. It's like moms, right? They can't do it all, it turns out. They pretend they do, but it turns out they cannot. Okay. So in the good old days, right, we hope 20 years ago, or maybe 30 years ago, we thought that structures could do a lot of things. And I was among those people. I got excited by set theoretical stuff because I like math. So it's cool, right? And if you tell me that math can do even more than it already does, I was like, oh yeah, I'll take it. I fell in love with philosophy when my math professor told me that you could not comb your head in a way that doesn't have a part, and that's actually a topological property of your head. And I thought it was the coolest thing in the world, right? So I'm that kind of person. So of course I thought that this notion of structure and structural talk was really tempting to try to make work. Okay, so what did we try to do with structures? A lot of things, right? So there was the idea that they would help us understand or make sense of the structure of scientific theory. And that was the semantic view in all of these versions, including the more sophisticated ones. And there was it was also helping with it is still maybe helping with structural representation, scientific representation, and structures would be kind of the ground for what the representation relationship is. And then we have also realism, right? We could solve everything, it seems, with structures. Oh, look, those realists are mistaken. It's not about entities, it's about structures and partial structures, because of course we're not going to claim that they get everything right. That's just stupid, right? But that's fine. They can grasp partial structures, and then that's great, right? Okay. All right, so we thought we could do a lot of things. It turns out we could not do it all, and some things didn't go the way we wanted. Here we go. So there's a long series of a vast list of articles and books that have been published on how structural talk is not doing all of that's needed to be doing. I'm just taking Maurizio last book because he's actually very systematic in the way that he presents both theories of representation and his own criticism of it. And I'm not necessarily endorsing all of those arguments, but those are the kinds of arguments that are out there, that have been out there, and I think that are actually very nicely synthesized in what is the title? Inference and Representation, is that right? Yeah, 2024 book. So some arguments, right? So representation is not always based on structural correspondence. Call it whatever you want. Could be similarity, could be some kind of homomorphism, isomorphism, whatever your version is, but some kind that, there's something about that makes representation, something about representation that is about structure. And it turns out representations come in a variety of ways and not necessarily in structural ways. Logic, so that was a classic argument. Anything that is correspondence-like, similarity-like, is symmetric, for example, and representation is not. It's reflexive and representation is not. I do not know. A representation doesn't represent itself, and what is represented doesn't represent the representation. So it seems like those kinds of relationships have the wrong logic. And then there's a long list of literature to show that it's neither necessary nor sufficient to have structures for representation. And there are examples again on both those things. A lot of this having to do with the variety of things representations do, or the variety of ways in which representation work. And so it turned out that that notion of structure being a core element of representation, solving a lot of problems that were associated with representation, realism, and the structure of scientific theories seemed to not work as well as we had hoped to. And at this point in my career, I just gave up on this thing and went to do something else. But before I did this, I actually said something. So this is an old paper from 2012, which somehow I brought back on my computer. It's like, what did I say at that time? And I think, it's fine. It's okay. So it's whatever. But I had, it's something I agree with myself, which is kind of reassuring. So in there, I agree with myself, and this is not like, again, a very original way to put it. Other people have done this. I think I put it in a very simple way in the paper, so I went back to it instead of trying to find more complicated thing, plus it's mine. So in that paper, what I try to do is to defend a modest version of the semantic view, and it's basically to say, don't make those giant claims and just, calm down now. It's going to be okay. Right? And we don't need to say that there is R families of model. We don't need, but we can say that they can be, considered or treated as, and it's a useful tool, and those kinds of things. But one thing I do in the paper is to distinguish, different things that structures or appeal to structures or structured talk could do. And basically, I say, well, look. There is a difference between looking at the structure of a thing, looking at how that structure relates to its function, and looking how you make pragmatic choices on the basis of how the structure relates to the function. And because I'm a sailor still, and I was more at the time at heart, I compare that with a sailboat, right? So you could have the blueprint of a sailboat, and that would be presumably a representation of some of its structure. But that doesn't tell you yet how that structure relates to how the boat deals with winds and currents and how it actually moves or floats, in all fairness. And then even if you have the function, you still don't have the pragmatics of it, which would tell you what kind of sailboats you want, depending, for example, whether you want to race or whether you want to take a family vacation, right? Which would be very, very different kinds of sailboats you want. Unless you want to make your family very miserable, which is already the case typically if you take them on the ocean. So I do not recommend, in addition to taking them to the ocean, you take them on the ocean on a racing boat. Take the big guy with like space inside and a toilet. Just make sure you have a toilet. Family vacation with a toilet, that's so much better. Just so much better. So I speak from experience. So, okay, so at the time I thought, this structured talk is probably very good to investigate the structural properties or the formal properties of models. It's not clear to me that it gives you an explanation for the representational relationship, and it's not clear to me that it gives you the function of representation, and it's not clear to me that it can give an explanation for the pragmatics of representation, so which representation you want in which context. And I think I still agree with myself, as I mentioned. Okay. So what happened next? Well, what happened next is basically those two other levels, the function and the pragmatics, got developed, right? And people started writing about it. And this is by no way especially here, the inferior account could have a lot of French and Bueno. But so I don't have enough room for all of the people who wrote about this. So it just what came to my mind as I was writing the slides. So it's not an exhaustive list of references, but you know what I'm talking about. So regarding the function, right? Regarding the relationship between the structure and the representational function, the fact that it represents something. Little by little, we built some kind of account of that relationship and what was possibly missing from the strict structure talk. One, agents play a role in representation, right? So representation is not a relationship just between a target and something that represents. It's a relationship between a target, what is meant to represent, and what a user or maker, right? And I do remember, so I was sitting in a graduate seminar with Batson Frassen, and he was working on his 2008 book. I didn't know he was working, but we were reading basically his chapters that we didn't know was part of the book, and we were commenting on it. That was the graduate seminar, which is a nice way to teach, by the way, when I think about it. I mean, how awesome is that, right? You just bring your own stuff to the table and ask very smart kids to tell you what you got wrong. That's just fantastic, right? Anyway, I wish I could do that. There's no way I can do that. But the department doesn't need me to present my work. They need me to teach philosophy and animals and philosophy of law. So anyways, so he I remember that day he came to class and he pulled a white piece of paper, and he looked at us and said, "This is a map of Paris." And we were just like looking at him and said, what is he talking about? He's lost it. We've got the news, guys. Bas lost it. But no, of course, his point was that I could make, a mapping between all the points on this piece of white paper and Paris. And so his point he was working on this notion that, of course, you need some kind of whatever you want to call it, indexicality, intentionality in a relationship with representation. You need some agent that uses really the representation to make it a representation. So other people have made even more stronger claim about representation that it's just a stipulation. That's Callender and Cohen. And I was hoping Quentin was here actually because he's got a nice article building up on the Callender and Cohen article, about this stipulative character of representation. So what we mean by stipulative is that you just have to say a representation is a representation to make it a representation. That's basically what you need, right? I can decide that this is a representation of my house. There we go. And the liquid, I don't know what the liquid is, but we'll figure it out. So I can, be on the beach in Brittany with my kids and ask them, do you even know where you are in France? And if they say no, I can just draw a map of France and then use a shell to tell them this is where Lorient is, right? And this is where we are. And so we can just stipulate representations. Okay. Another aspect of representation that is not really well captured by the structured talk is this notion of exemplification, right? So Goodman is behind this. Elgin has been repeating it for as far as I can tell, as long as she's been publishing, and including in her last book. But it is an important part of representation that you represent something as. And so you are exemplifying, of course, representation is selective, right? I guess I didn't say that. It's selective because if you don't select something in representation, you do a reproduction. Now, reproductions have a role to play. I guess there are reproduction in art, right? People do that. But that's pretty rare. Most of the time, you don't reproduce a system if you just reproduce a community, an ecological community and say, here, I explained it to you. So nope, it's the same thing. That doesn't help us. So typically, we need to select some aspects of the target system in order to have some kind of epistemic value to the representation we have. So it is selective, and typically it's also not only selective, but it also exemplifies the system as bearer of certain properties. Okay, so the stipulation, the exemplification, again, are things that seem to be crucial to the representation relationship, not necessarily the reducible to structure relationship. And finally, we now think that it's not only one agent, but a multiplicity of agents, right? So Massimi in her 2022 book, Elgin in the book that I missed the discussion of, unfortunately, but I read the book, right, because I was supposed to comment on it. Talk about, epistemic communities, and ecological communities. But of course, we are almost never isolated agent in our epistemic endeavors, right? We rely on a ton of background knowledge, on teachers, on parents. And unless you Descartes and you isolate yourself in the middle of nowhere in a cabin, when you just throw out everything that everybody told you ever, and by the way, he doesn't recommend you do that, right? Even he doesn't recommend you do that. In fact, he tells you should never do more than 1 hour of metaphysics a year. There are better things to do with your life than metaphysics, guys. So you might want to do sorry. So you might want to do it once, and you take it as everybody is like killing each other in the streets for religious reasons. You might as well isolate yourself. You give yourself into a little cabin. Fight, by the way, across the river because he was attacked across a river and he fought with his sword for his life, saved his own life with his sword. Anyway, and then go to this cabin by the fire with the little fire, and then go into the matrix and come back. Okay, half come back. depending on whether you take the God thing to be a real thing. Which, anyway, so epistemic communities, except for Descartes during that 1 week of metaphysics, we all live within epistemic communities. We all depend on epistemic communities. And that also is absolutely crucial for any epistemic endeavor, and including representation. And then what replaced, at least the one I prefer, replaced this idea that structures would do all the work. Well, there's some kind of inferential account here that I think is getting most things right. There are various versions of the inferential account, but basically it's about the surrogative power of representations, and also this notion of deflation, right? Which is like, we're not going to give a fundamental analysis of representation. It's likely that maybe there is none, and that instead what we need to do is to see how it works, and it's good enough. Okay, so that's for the function. So you remember that we had those 3 levels. We had the first level, which was about the investigation of the formal properties of representations. The second level was how do structures, or how we create the representational function of representations, and then so that's what we just covered. And then finally, there's the pragmatics, and that has exploded, right? I put Wendy here mostly because I like Wendy very much. But she's not the only one, right? There's lots of people who have been talking about pragmatics of representation. Anderson and Mitchell, Holly Anderson and Sandy Mitchell have a edited book that's coming out right now, or came out last year, I forget. Anyway, about precisely pragmatism. You have conferences on pragmatism in science and philosophy of science. Of course, that goes back, way back with Nancy Cartwright and Margaret Morrison, and so it's not like it's new. But that's basically, to me at least, the way I see things, is that it has been added as one of the elements of the components of a decent, decently comprehensive view of representation. You have like what it's made of, and then you have how it serves its function, and finally there is how we use it. There is a question that I haven't talked about. It's about ontology. So if you look at Frege and Nguyen article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there will be one question, which is what kind of objects are representation? I actually don't really care. I never did. So that's my fault. As I mentioned, I don't want to do metaphysics more than an hour a year. And during that hour, pretty much want to say that, I don't need to care about this. I don't need to care. So I spend an hour a year to say that I don't really need to solve all those problems that metaphysicians solve. And that's just a stance I take on metaphysics. But if you are interested in the ontology of representation, there is, of course, people working on that. And I'm sure there are some very interesting and tricky problems there. I just never looked at them because I just really fundamentally don't care. But I'm very interested in how we use them. All right. So I totally, by design, ignore the question of ontology here. Apologies, non-apologies. That's what you can do after your tenure. I mean, you can fight me on this. I'm happy to hear why I'm wrong. But anyways, okay. So that brings us back to this notion. So what's that for structures, right? Because I haven't talked about structures for the last maybe 10 minutes. And so I'm wrapping my brain around this. I still stick with the notion that the structured talk is an extremely effective way and useful way to think about formal relationships within a formal structure of representations, how they relate with one another, how they can embed one into another, all those kinds of things. I think there's great work done in that area, and I think it's useful work, and I think it's always cool to look at the formal mathematics of various representations we have. Not all representations are mathematical, I understand that. And the example I have here is like robustness analysis. So for example, I think that what Weisberg did with robustness analysis by saying that a robust theorem is to show that there is a structure there, that if you have within the representation this basic setup, then you will get this result. It doesn't mean that it exists in the world, but it exists that this is a common structure across the various models that are robust in predicting that thing. Again, the fact that those models agree doesn't show that that relationship exists in the world, that those causes exist in the world, and that prediction is going to be true of the world. That takes more work than just robustness. Go check it out. It's an empirical question. You're not going to decide an empirical question by looking at common structures across models, but it gives you an idea of where to look. But fundamentally, I do think that this idea that robustness is a robust theorem is really about a common structure across multiple models is interesting. And that's talk about structure, right? That's exactly talk about structure. So I really want to dig my heels on there. It's like, this hasn't stopped. This hasn't changed. There's something very valuable to look at the formal properties or more or less formal properties or structural properties of our representations, especially scientific representations, in order to see how they relate with one another or even understand their own structure and see what the blind spots are that we heard from this morning, right? What are the blind spots? What are the things what are the assumptions that are in there? What is meant to, what is held constant or what is taken to be linear when maybe it's not, those kinds of things. Okay. And it's not comprehensive, right? So structure talk is not going to solve everything. And it's not going to, so if we want to say something like, maybe Maria wants to say, right, that understanding or how we make sense of the world is fundamentally structural or depends on some kind of grasping structure. I'm like, is that going to be true everywhere? And I'm worried. So some of the worries I've had, well, what about those people talking about embodied cognition, right? Is that about structure? Maybe you'll say yes. And what about emotional cognition? Is that about structure? Maybe. Is that useful to talk about structure? Is it a useful talk? Is it fundamentally about structure? Are you making like a ontology, metaphysical claim, ontological claim, or constitutive claim? Or are you saying that it's useful to think about structure in those things? So I'm just, I'm thinking about the embodied cognition of a dancer, for example, and I used to kind of dance, and I don't remember thinking about structures, but maybe I was. So I have worries, and I'm thinking, but still that intuition is so strong, it's hard to let go. So okay, so let's say there are some things that are not, but some things that are, right? A good portion, maybe, of what we do is about grasping structure or looking at corresponding structures or how structures relate to one another, even if maybe there are some exceptions, but that doesn't mean it's not a good idea. Okay, but then I'm really worried that you need to say more about what structure is. I mean, maybe someone wants to say it's like a primitive notion. But really? So I'm always worried. It's like this is it seems like it's such a vague notion that I don't know exactly what it is. And I mean, sure. I mean, maybe Ottavio is going to say you see structure, and that's a primitive notion, and there is nothing to say about it. I don't know if that's what you're going to say. And I could possibly buy that, but my head wants to go a little further. So if we are going to say that cognition or understanding is fundamentally about grasping structure, that's how it seems like we should see whether cognitive science agrees with us. And so is it the case that the people in cognitive science conceive of human cognition as representational structures? Maybe, but they disagree, right? So is it that it's causal reasoning? Is it Bayesian networks? Is it computing? Is it, or is it graphical models like Dank says? David Dank says, like, I'm going to unify all of it. It's graphical models all the way down. Even the turtle and the elephant, they're all about graphical models. But then here's the thing, right? We get to the point where we have multiple possible accounts now of what those structures are like. So we have possible models of cognition. And now, so how do we understand that? So we understand our understanding in terms of structure, and I feel like I'm in the loop. And I'm getting uncomfortable with myself in the loop. I get dizzy. I got old, and I don't know if you know that, but as you get old, your inner ear liquid thickens, and that makes you more prone to become dizzy. It's really annoying, turns out. So you want to dance at a certain age, like you really have to do the head thing because you'll get dizzy very quickly. Anyways, so I get dizzy, right? And intellectually dizzy. I'm wondering, so is it the case now that what we are saying is not necessarily that we want to commit that, cognition or understanding of how we make sense of the world is fundamentally about structure, or is it that pragmatics strikes back and, and the Death Star is back, and it's about what is useful for us. And in which case, is it the case that talk about structures when it comes to understanding or when it comes to cognition is the best way, or one of the best ways for us to make sense of cognition? But then again, I can do this game again, right? So I'm kind of stuck there. That's it. That's what I've got. Oh, there's a conclusion. I forgot I wrote a conclusion. I wrote that from this morning. So I should have a conclusion. Okay, we have this strong intuition, which I share with a lot of people, I think, in this room, that cognition, understanding how we make sense of the world has something to do with grasping structure, whatever grasping. I don't want to touch grasping, by the way. Don't ask any question about grasping. I'll give a very short answer. But it has something to do about getting structures. It seems to me that the last decades have shown that structures cannot do it all, just like moms. It seems to me like we tried, man. Turns out we better understand that no, we just need a solid B in everything we're trying to do. It seems to me that some kind of information or some kind of input from cognitive science seems necessary to start talking about human cognition. It seems silly not to. And then there's a question of how that's going to help. And then because precisely we end up with that question, whether we are talking about a fundamental feature of cognition, or do we want to make that strong claim, or are we going to talk about a useful tool to make sense of how we navigate the world? And then finally, I get to that dizziness. And I don't know how to get out of it. That's it. This one is the right one.
Thank you very much. I think we have between 10 and 15 minutes for questions. So,
So thanks. I think there are lots of very interesting ideas there. And there's something about Maurice's latest book that puzzles me. But I'm sympathetic with the deflationary approach.
It's always healthy to the deflated things.
I agree. But if you go too far, deflate too much,
right,
you also lose explanatory power.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that happened with his account.
Right.
He became so deflationary because he said, well, there's no relation between the target and the source.
Right.
That's a big mistake that, for example, the differential.
You have a relationship, right?
Yeah. So, I think the mappings are crucial.
Yeah.
Right? And if you don't require that, for example, he's not in a position to explain why is it that some inferences are reliable and others are not.
Yeah.
I can't do that because I said, look, those inferences reserve truth and the others do not. Right? And that's an explanation that if you go too deflationary, you lose.
Right.
So you have to find the proper balance.
I agree.
Yeah.
And it's funny because he's talking about this representational force, right?
Yeah.
And what is that?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good fact.
It's just like, it seems like it's a metaphorical way to refer to what people have been looking for in terms of that
relationship between the target and does the work of representation.
That's right.
And so it is interesting. But then what worries me about accounts like yours is that I still have been very convinced that the only possible, embedding, similarity, correspondence, whatever you want to call it, relationship between structure and the world is not between the structure and the world, but between the structure and the data models. I'm having a hard time understanding what we mean when we talk, oh, there's a structure in the world. Is there, I feel like there's a structure that we pick out, and that's what your experimental setup, it's not for the world. It's an empirical setup. And to me, at this point, we already have selected and interpreted what's happening there. But then that moves the question to the next phase. So if that's solved, then also between my whatever representation I had, the Sedot-Voltaire model, and my data model of the actual population, then that moves the question to the next thing. What about between the data model and the next thing? And I don't know that there is a good case to make about structure.
Well, I do have an answer to that, right? Because I do think we can literally map parts of the world into a mathematical model. So when I'm thinking about empirical setup, I'm talking about the world, right? And so here's a simple case. I'm having friends for dinner. So I want to make sure that there is a one-to-one correspondence between the number of plates on the table and the number of guests plus,
Right.
Now, that one-to-one correspondence is a mapping between the plates and the guests. And so, I don't need to set up a mathematical model to that.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
And that's how those things will go. And you of course, in some cases, you need some intermediary models, right? But you're grounding these models into bits and pieces of the world.
So, I mean, yeah, you agree that there are some cases in which the construction of the data itself is highly theoretical, where it involves a lot of stuff, right?
In some cases, yeah.
Yeah, in some cases, absolutely.
But these are not
the dinner party, but
but they're not free flowing.
Yeah,
right? So you ground those
So
things.
what do you want to say, that there is a way to go down to a moment where actually things were picked up out of the world and put in there?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the way I think.
Right.
And of course, it is, again, a reification of mathematics to say we cannot do that. Isomorphism, for example, is only defined over mathematical structures. If you say that, you're assuming a set theoretic representation of structures. But that's not a very good one, right?
No.
And it's an artifact of that representation. That's one of the blind spots. They'll say, well, isomorphism are functions over sets. So I need to have sets to have an. You don't. You can
extract. Right. You see isomorphism as an abstraction over those more primitive.
You can formulate the notion.
That's right.
You formulate the notion of isomorphism in secondary logic.
Right.
You don't need sets for that.
Yeah. So back to your original comment, I agree with you that there is that right middle ground to find between what makes the representation relation without refining too many things, as few as possible, ideally, but also without losing the, without falling into the irrelevance problem, right? And so there has to be a way to limit the relevant inferences, which is not circular, and which is not, which is reasonably general. So structure might be one way. I mean, your model could be one way. There might be other ways, but it is. I agree that this is what's missing. But I don't agree with Roman, that it has to be grounded in something like ontological. That's where he wants to go, right? He wants to say that relationship is like really kind of metaphysical thing, and I'm like, no, thanks.
Yeah.
Guadalupe and then Maria. Did you raise your hand?
Just-
You were the last one, sorry.
Okay. So Guadalupe, Maria, yes.
Thank you. When you review we can say, new perspectives on models, as inferentialism, explication, or exemplification, etc., I think like it seems like each of these perspectives recovers some important aspect of the pragmatics of model, but it also seems that there is some explanatory loss in each perspective. Do you think that's the case?
How so? So he was come to mind for me is like I actually feel like I have some better explanation of representations when I understand that it depends on the nature and the context of inquiry and those kinds of things. So what do you have in mind? What is lost? Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. So for that last bit, I agree that when we go too far, and we just remove, so once we say, well, structure, there's a difference between saying that structures cannot do it all and structures do nothing. Like just because mom can't do it all doesn't mean that they don't do anything. But that's just silly. I don't do it all, but God, I do a lot. So I think that part of the thing that were on the board there on the slide were add-ons, right? So structures are not enough. You also have to have agents. Agents come with epistemic communities. You also have to have exemplification to explain the selection process and how that selection actually functions. Those kinds of things, right? The deflationary inferential view of representation basically said not only structures aren't enough, but says something like we don't even need, they're unnecessary, right? And I can have representation way more cheaply, even more cheaply than you guys empiricists trying to talk about structures. So I think that's a very different move. And so you can still keep all those add-ons that explain some other parts of representation, but not accept that structures do nothing and we can get rid of them. Or if you don't think that structures do the work and it's something else that does the work, then like the picking up and the selecting and the embedding into entities or whatever they are that Ottavio is talking about, then you can keep structure, you can do something else there. But I think those are two different moves. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cecile. I think we are partially on the same boat after your landscape of the different discussions that are around the structures. So something that is fascinating to me is that there is a very strong and very well shared intuition about structures do a lot of things for us. So it doesn't really matter whether you are a philosopher, a logician, or whatever you are doing. There's a sense in which structures are embedded in our brain as a solution for many problems, such as providing explanations and so on. And so I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on the similarities between that very basic intuition that we have and the intuitions that philosophers can express. So not necessarily in the mathematical side, but in the in-between part. Right. Like that corresponds with the intuition that you mentioned at the beginning. I think, we all think that the structures are grounding many of our epistemic practices, many of our other types of practices, and so would you think that they share some important connections, or only the fact that there is some relation between the two things? And that's
Yeah, so the worry here, thanks, I really appreciate it. And I mean, this is a big question. I'm like,
yeah, we are all making questions.
I'm making things out. Again, I don't have a view on this, like a full, well-articulated view. I just have a bunch of questions. So the question I have here, and it's been worrying me, it doesn't keep me up at night, but close, is it the case that when we talk about structures, it's one of those metaphorical terms that is either trivial or false, right? So if you take it to the very serious way with set theory and whatever, that's false, right? I mean, it's not going to pass a lot of laugh tests. And then again, I mean, I was among the people who hoped it would be doing a lot of work, and it does some, right? We have some examples of very cool philosophical work on the basis of that idea. I think Lloyd is one of the for biology was one of the most impressive, at least to me. Maybe that's because she was a woman in philosophy of science. I was like, oh my God, they exist. But it doesn't. It's too strong to anything that's going to say this is what it is. Where structures are set theoretical, blah blah blah. No, they're not. That's not what we have in that intuition, and doesn't even start to cover the range and the scope of cases that we would want an intuition to cover. But then the question is, if it's not that strict thing, is it the case that we have just a trivial metaphor and we're just playing with words, right? And that's the worry I have. So I really want to make the notion of structure more precise, but at the same time, I feel like if I make it too precise, it becomes too narrow, and I don't know how to solve that problem.
Maybe it is that you see structures like you see possibilities.
We have the last two questions. One is Axel's, and the other one is online.
Diana was. No, I really like this, but okay, I still don't fully understand the dialectic because, for example, especially when you answer on that side, because the quantifiers are not explicit, so I still don't see exactly what are the hypotheses at stake. Because, for example, when Suarez said structural similarities are not necessary for representation, just simply like that, that's like a very, very, very cheap claim, right? Because only the amounts is that sometimes representation is not structural, and that is obviously true, right? So why is that there? It was something that we have to take in consideration. Even the most structuralist is going to think that at least labels and icons are going to be directly referential, maybe names. So I don't see why it's an issue whether it is, but it's obviously not necessary. But you seem to think that there is something there that he's saying. So it must be something else besides it is not always necessary, and it can also not be. It is never necessary, because that would also be so trivially true, right? So what is he saying when he says that?
So you could see it in different ways. So I think, well, first off, there is the game of philosophy, right? So the rhetorical game of philosophy, which consists in depicting, others in certain ways. And so, we saw that this morning. The semantic view is wrong for those reasons. Well, and then the first answer was but some defenders of the semantic view have more sophisticated accounts. So you can always, then that's how we end up, talking to each other for a long time. So I think that, you could say structures do the work, but they don't do it all. And that was never my claim. I think that's fair. That's totally fair. I do think that there is some truth in this book. That's why I also said that I don't necessarily, endorse all of Suarez's arguments. I think it's a nice way to put it out there as a summary of what people have been saying about the structuralist view. Whether those arguments are convincing or not, I'm not taking a stance on that. I do think that there is something to say about those add-ons, those things that are not captured by the structuralist account, that have to do with intentionality or indexicality, with exemplification and those kinds of things. Those are real things for me. Now, whether it can be simplified in those nice, it's nice to have 4 things though. I think he's got 5. Whatever. But so I do not take this as a convincing necessary argument. I agree with you that you can have more sophisticated view that, go around those kinds of arguments. I do think that there is something to say about structures don't do it all. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I will ask Mauricio Suarez if he wants to give a talk and defend himself next year or something like that. And now we have the last questions, and Rosa says, can you say more about emotional cognition, please?
Yeah, I don't know much about that. So I can't say a lot, but I mean, there is some research in ethics, for example, right? So I'm moving like far away from where we're supposed to talk about. But in ethics, there is Martha Nussbaum has some very convincing arguments that emotions play, and it's coming way back to Hume, right? But there is a revival of this notion that ethical behavior is far from being solely rational, and typically is not rational, but rather based in some kind of emotional cognition. So one example that Nussbaum talks about is outrage, right? So that's an emotion that's going to be conducive of action, for example, of ethical action. If you're outraged by some things that happen in the world right now, for example, maybe you go rally or you do stuff. So the idea is that, and then so that's one aspect. Another aspect of this is there is an entire realm of philosophy looking at the ethics of attention, right? So Iris Murdoch is one of those philosophers, and so here it does serve a purpose to teach classes outside of your area of specialization. In animals, in philosophy of animals, the way we relate to animals, for example, is certainly not through linguistic, except in San Diego with the guy with the buttons. But otherwise, if you're not the guy with the buttons in San Diego, you don't talk to your dog with words. You have all kinds of other ways in which you communicate with your dog, right? And you get communication from your dog. And so there is an entire way to think about embodied cognition, what we call body language, right? Which is most of communication for animals. Embodied cognition, emotional cognition. And so this is not necessarily in the process of representational structures, but it is something different. And I don't know what it is, again, and I'm not a philosopher of this, but I know that those things are not necessarily captured by, those kinds of formal structures that we like to put on mathematical objects. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
The last one, please, very, very fast because it's already.
Okay. I was actually going to talk today about the relationship between embodied cognition and structuralism. I decided to not because I was too confused about medicines on this. But now that you brought it up, as far as I know, embodied cognition, which is very little, the notion of the structure is very precious because embodied cognition requires information. It's hard to make sense of cognition without picking up information. And information has to be comprehended and understood in some structural sense because we cognize by exploring the environment and by recognizing what is invariant in that environment. So we recognize what is invariant in the structures of the environment.
That sounds like a model of what's happening here to me, not necessarily what's happening. So I'm just back to the worry about whether this is, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, but the conclusion is that Gibson's notion of ecological information is actually based on the idea of the invariance of structures that specify an action for an organism. So if you remove the structural pattern, it's hard to say what is specifying the actions. And then I don't know if you have some notion of cognition about information, also notion of information about structures.
I don't know. I don't have any of that. I don't have account of any of that. That's very interesting. I appreciate the comment. I could see, because I don't know much about this. I just want to say I don't know, right? It's not obvious to me that that what you described is not an abstract model of what, how we best understand embodied cognition. So I don't know. But I have worries that we are imposing some structured talk there on something which is slightly different. That's my worry. But I get your points. The points are very well taken. They're excellent. I mean, absolutely. There are some, you can definitely, it's useful to think about that kind of cognition in terms of invariant, right? So if I'm running with my dog and we get to a moment where there are two paths, he's going to stop at the branch between the two paths, turn around and look at me, and I'm going to go like this, and he's going to go there, right? And the environment of my body is there, and then the variable is where my arm goes. And if I go like this, he knows he gets to choose, because I don't care. Like, you are an autonomous being, man. You choose. So there's definitely invariance of my body. I don't do that with my legs. He would be very confused, I think, if I started doing stuff with my legs. But he does understand the variable this, or this. So I get that we could make a description and possibly explain. So I have a model of what's happening there. I am not absolutely certain that this is what's actually happening in my dog's mind, but maybe it is. Maybe all is about pattern recognition and invariant. And maybe that's what structure is. But then it's a very cheap notion of structure, isn't it?
Let's think what it is.